And I was going to start off with saying, and now for something completely different, because it really is. So I'm just going to do a brief whistle-stop tour of what data visualization and visual culture and how they interact in the kind of ways of which we can think of it. So to start, what is visual culture? Well, put simply, it's the study of anything within our culture which communicates through visual means. And so visual culture is really about things in the everyday, things that we encounter, images, how we encounter images, how we receive them, how they're represented. It's generally studied under art history. So as mentioned, I have a master's in art history, and so this is where this comes in. But you really don't see it in many other departments, which is also kind of interesting. It's interesting that data visualization doesn't have a huge footprint within the visual cultural studies as well. So visual representation and presentation of data, of course, as we know, has shifted. It's engaging users more aesthetically. We're looking at our visualizations in terms of formal elements, color, other types of ways in which we communicate. And so with that communication comes the reception and underlying meanings and results that come with that. So as we know, before visualization technologies, a lot of things were done by hand. I pulled this visualization from a report that my father actually wrote in 1978 around engineering and economic evaluation of explosive castings of overburden. You don't have to know anything about what that means. It's more to the point, it's just understanding kind of what's being represented visually before all of our visual technologies kind of started to take hold. It was drawn by hand. It may not look like it because the lines are really sort of straight and the curves are really nice, but it was drawn by hand. And it's something that was distributed to a select audience. So this means maybe a boardroom full of engineers talking about the subject of mining. It didn't really have a huge amount of reach in terms of visualizing something for the broader audiences. Now, as we know, visualization is everywhere. Data visualization has become the interest of everybody, which is why visual culture really comes into play here, because it's interested in the everyday visuals that are presented to people. Formal elements have become more visually appealing. I used an example here from the German national election that happened a couple years ago. What's interesting about this is I was trying to think of what's a good thing for me to include as part of visual elements, and what do I think is good or valuable for this slide. And I chose this one because it kept a memory. So it imprinted on me. I took in the image, I started to interpret it. I was really interested in what it represented. And so as a result, I recalled that memory of that image. So again, we interpret a degree of value based on the visual elements that we make. That can be a good or a bad thing. Let's make that clear, because again, we are interpreting data. We want to make sure we're presenting and allowing for accurate interpretation, but at the same time, the aesthetic has a huge role to play. So one of the elements in visual culture is around presentation, reception, and visuality. So I have a quote here: visual images succeed or fail according to the extent that we can interpret them successfully. And I think if we think about data visualization in this context, that's a very true statement for us. Our visualizations succeed whether or not the audience can actually interpret them correctly. So I included, I think this has been making the rounds on Twitter. This is a very old school data visualization that was produced many, many years ago. So thinking about how it's presented to us, how we're receiving it, can we understand what's happening with the information? Can we interpret it? How are we interpreting? And not only that, what is the impression? Like my first impression is like, that's a lot of look. I mean, there's a lot going on with that visualization. But am I getting anything valuable out of it? And what does it mean to me? So I'm going to shift now to a contemporary example. This is a visualization that was produced by Georgia Lupi. Some of you may know who she is. She's one of the pairs that was doing Dear Data, and she works mainly in sort of the infographics visualization world. And this is a chart that was pulled from an atomic clock report that her company did, A Warming Planet. Now, obviously, you can kind of draw some formal elements from the last. There's area charts, there's bar charts, there's the formal elements are very similar, but what kind of impression does this image leave on you? How are you interpreting it? What does it mean to you? And do you find it more valuable because you're receiving it and interpreting it in sort of in a more aesthetic way? Another component of visual culture is representation, and this is probably one of the most broadly studied areas of visual culture. It's concerned with what is being presented and what is being represented in those images. So you can think of our data visualizations are representing the data. It's a representation of the data, and we're representing it through a visual means. So it's not only that representation that really matters, there is a push and pull. So you got to think about, okay, I'm representing data, but it's also being received. So that's the reception. There's a push and pull. And it is also reflective of us as producers. I have another quote. Keith Moxie is a well-known art historian in visual studies. And one of the things he talks about is how images are created to transfer information, as we know, but how they're perceived is really dependent on the medium that they're perceived. And a varied medium can mean that we're receiving it in different ways. So we can think of this in terms of the types of charts that we choose. We choose charts to represent our data, but what is the representation of our data? How does that change if we put our data in the context of a different chart? So there we go. So I pulled this physical data visualization project called Perpetual Plastic. Again, this was done entirely on a beach, combining plastic. And so thinking about representation, this medium was chosen to represent an idea around how much perpetual plastic is in the environment. How does this image land? How does this image land, say, if it was only done on pen and paper? So the medium really kind of helps us with our interpretation and representation of the data, whether it's effective or not. And then lastly, there's the very, very sticky element, which is culture. It's very difficult to go into this because it means a lot of different things. It covers a lot of different meaning. But when we think about data visualization, culture representation can be incredibly important because we're representing our data, but we're representing it to different types of people, different types of frameworks, different types of contextual areas. And the people who are receiving our data also may imprint their own identities around that. And so it's very important for us to really think about what that communication is with our visuals. They can serve as communicative bridges. And there's also, again, the role of identity in terms of interpreting the images, how someone identifies with the data that we're visualizing. And that is it. Thank you.